Well, welcome to another episode of Cage-Free Theology. I'm Clint Archer.
And I'm Will Brannon.
What's our question today, Will?
Our question for the day is, why was the Council of Nicaea so significant?
Okay, that's a timely question. We'll explain why. Let's get into it.
All right, so this one is a little bit different than most episodes we do. We could think of this as a two-part episode. So we're going to have this episode talking about the history of the Council of Nicaea, and then another episode right after this talking about the significance of the Council of Nicaea today. So
right, because the Nicene Creed was the biggest product.
Right.
So we'll do a whole one on the Creed.
Right, just on the Creed itself. So as far as the background of the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed, what is a church council and what was the Council of Nicaea?
So the Council of Nicaea was a gathering of church leaders. They were called bishops, and we'll get into what that means. About 318 of these bishops met in the town of Nicaea, which is close to modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. And it was presided over by the emperor, Constantine. And the idea was that they were going to talk about doctrine. And this was the first sort of universal church gathering of leaders where they were going to decide things that everybody believes, or at least recognize what is allowed to be taught in all the churches.
And when you say universal church gathering, you mean bishops from all over the empire?
Right. I mean, these were leaders of churches all over the known Christian world at that point.
Right. So, and it met in, you might have already said this, 325 AD, and met not just one meeting. This is something that happened over multiple months.
It happened over 10 weeks, and the last week was the 25th of August, 325 AD, which makes this the 1700th anniversary of the conference. That's why we're talking about it.
Right. So you mentioned a key name in there that we can start with this gentleman. You mentioned Constantine. So before we talk about the importance of Nicaea, we should probably establish the importance of Constantine. So can you give a few historical comments on Constantine, or why is he important to the Council of Nicaea itself?
Yeah, well, what was fascinating about this is it's the very first time you have church and state melded together.
For Christians.
For Christians, yeah. So you've got Christians were completely separate from the Roman Empire, and here you have an emperor calling a council of Christian leaders, and they willingly came. And so it all boils down to the fact that this was the first Roman emperor who claimed to be a Christian. So the story has it that he was going to depose the co-Caesar. You know, there was an Augustus and a Caesar. There were a couple of different leaders at the time, and he wanted to be the supreme one, the only one. And so as he was going into battle, he allegedly had a vision. He claimed to have a vision. And sometimes I've heard it described as just a formation in the clouds, or he saw this in some way. And what he saw was what would look to us like an X with a capital P through it, which are the Greek letters chi and rho, the first two letters of Christos, or Christ. And so he took this as a sign from God that Christ was the true God. And some versions of the vision have revelation coming to him in his dream or vision or whatever. But the point is, what he did is he told everybody in his army to put the chi and the rho on their shield as a kind of a superstitious or whatever, but a sign that they were going to fight as Christians. And then he won. And so he attributed that to the power of Christ and declared himself a Christian, although he wouldn't get baptized until many years later. In fact, just a few days before he died.
Near the end of his life, right? So before we get to the Council of Nicaea, how does that change Rome? How is the experience of a believer different pre-Constantine versus post-Constantine?
Well, the Roman emperors, as everybody knows, they were pagans, so they believed they were a god. They worshipped the Roman gods. They encouraged the worship of Roman gods. They did not like the idea that Christians refused to worship the Roman gods. And so now, you have one who is claiming to be a Christian, and so he lifted the persecution. So under Diocletian, which was a previous emperor, until about the year 311, there was this, I think it was like 8-year persecution where it was legal to kill Christians, to confiscate their property, to imprison them, to torture them. And this was completely different now. For the first time, you have an emperor. He actually released something called the Edict of Milan, which was like a major statement saying now it's not legal to target Christians, and all of their property that had been confiscated, including church buildings and that kind of thing, had to be returned. And so for the first time, you have a Roman emperor who is pro-Christianity.
Right. So the Edict of Milan is in 313, and basically now Rome recognizes Christianity as a valid religion. Some people think Rome at that point becomes a quote-unquote Christian nation. That's not technically what happened.
No.
Paganism is still the predominant worldview, but now you don't have, it's much more of a tolerated religion.
Yes.
So there's a lot of criticism of Constantine and some of the things that he did. I always joke around with people and say, I would rather live post-Constantine than pre-Constantine in terms of life and suffering as a believer. So how do we get from Edict of Milan, Constantine, now Christianity is a legally tolerated religion in Rome, and then we're calling a church council? Fill in some of those gaps for us.
So when Constantine conquered the other ruler, he united the empire. Now he's the supreme emperor. He called himself the emperor, and he's in charge of everything. But he sees that the empire is starting to, in his words, fall apart because of the dissension within the church. And so he's like, I just united this whole thing for Christ, and now the Christians are fighting over two particular issues, which we can get into. And so he said, we need to sort this out. It's kind of like if your kids are always fighting about whose toy that is. You're like, let's sit down, have a family meeting, and decide who had it first, or whatever it was, And so he called this council and actually paid for people who couldn't afford for these leaders to travel. They paid for their transport, their accommodation, and they willingly came. They wanted to do this because they knew about this controversy, the Arian controversy and the Paschal controversy, and they wanted that sorted out. And so they came, and he presided over the thing. And a lot of Protestants kind of view that as the beginning of the end, because the free church is now melded to the state. And, we believe in a separation of church and state as Baptists. But in those days, this was considered a good thing, that the state was pro-Christian. This is going to be good for Christianity. And it was at first.
Yeah, when we talk about church history, we have to talk about these men and these events in the context that they happen. We can't read back onto them our modern understandings of politics or church and state, things like that. So before this, you have paganism is the state-promoted religion. Now you start to see the state be more involved with Christianity. And as this council comes together, this is kind of hard for us to grasp. I mean, we have accounts of people fighting in the streets over these debates. A religious debate so significant, Constantine's like, figure this out so that Rome stays united. I mean, can you imagine if there was so much theological debate today, Donald Trump was like, hey, get a bunch of Christians together and figure out, is Jesus God?
It's just not how we do things.
Yeah, it's just completely different, but we need to let it stand for what it was then. This is the lives that they had. So you mentioned the two debates, Arianism, the Arian controversy, and then the Paschal controversy. Which one do you want to dive into first?
Let's do Arianism. That was the biggest one.
Okay.
So Arius was one of the bishops. Maybe we should first talk about who the bishops are. So you've got Constantine, who's the emperor. These 318 or so, accounts vary. And we should say, if there's a history buff out there who's saying, well, actually, this is not our area of expertise.
We like reading and learning.
Yes, we like to learn. We like church history, and we're doing this because it's the 1700th anniversary of the council. But this is not theology or biblical studies, so it's a little out of our bailiwick. But we're doing our best here, so have patience. But this 300 or so bishops that were there. So a bishop is not exactly what we think of today when you think of the Catholic bishops or the Anglican bishops. So you had what we would call pastors. The New Testament uses the term pastor, overseer, which is, that's what the word bishop is, episkopos. We get the English word bishop or overseer. And presbyteros, which means elder. It uses those interchangeably. So I'm a pastor. That means I'm also a bishop / overseer / elder. In their parlance, though, you had elders were kind of the pastor of a local church, the leader of a local church, and whoever the main guy was in the biggest city nearby would be given oversight not only of his own congregation, but the other churches maybe in the city or in the region. Usually if there was a church in a city, there was only one. And so you had these, I think there were 5 main ones, Alexandria, Rome, of course, Antioch, and a couple of others. And these these leaders of those particular churches were called bishops. And if you were one in a particularly big city like Rome, you were actually called a metropolitan.
Mm-hmm.
And if an elder wanted to do something a little different, or had a confusion about doctrine, or needed some help or guidance, he would go to the pastor of the big church in the big city. He would go to his bishop. So over time, from the time of the apostles, it didn't really have that, although the apostles were there, so they were kind of the ones in charge of those churches. From the time of the apostles till now, about 200 years later or so, you've got a growing authority in these bishops. And so when Constantine calls a meeting, it's not for all the pastors in the whole world. It's like, let's get the 300 most important pastors here, the ones that all the others report to, the ones that all the others look up to. And so they weren't really appointed by a council like they are today. They were just recognized as the leaders of significant churches. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, there's an analogy today, the way we have that in the evangelical church, because we sort of have these evangelical conferences where you'll have, John MacArthur from Los Angeles and John Piper from Minneapolis. And, you may have, maybe there's a Paul Washer up there, or an H.B. Charles, L. Moeller from Louisville. And it's always the same kind of guys. And you'll hear pastors saying, well, Piper's view is this on tongues. Well, MacArthur's view is that. Well, who are these people? These are just local pastors. They're not appointed by anyone. They don't have any special authority. And yet there's a recognition based on their learning, based on their track record of faithfulness, the success of their ministry, that they have something to teach. Also usually because of their writings, that they have something to teach. And so we look up to them. And in the same way, that's how the bishops started, and until it became an entrenched system where now when a bishop of Rome dies, there's another one appointed to be the bishop of Rome. And then he becomes significant just because he's the bishop of that city. So that's who the 300 bishops were. So I forget the question you asked.
So we have about 300 bishops were present. There were also elders and there were deacons present at the Council of Nicaea, but we focus on the bishops. And Arius is, if I remember correctly, an elder, not a bishop, from Alexandria. Right. So why is Arius important to this whole scene?
Yeah, he was the one that started this controversy because he became convinced that Jesus Christ, although he didn't have any problem calling him God and saying he was divine, he said that he had a beginning. So his famous statement is, there was a time when he was not.
Right.
And he gets that from Proverbs 8:22, where, Lady Wisdom is being personified. And in those days, people were quite universally convinced that we're speaking about Christ. And the Greek version of that text makes it sound like he was created. He was brought forth, he was created. And so that he latched onto, now the Hebrew doesn't say that, but he latched onto that Greek word and made the point that Jesus, everything we really believe about Jesus, he still believed, except for this idea that he came out of God at a point, and before that he was not there. So he was made out of something, was Arius's point. He was made out, he was made out of nothing, like ex nihilo, like everything else is. And so he's in the category of creature, and he's very special and all that kind of stuff, but he's made out of his own substance that God made him. And the whole universal church believed, no, Jesus was fully God, and that he was eternal, and there was no beginning, and that he was made out of the same substance as God, is kind of one way to think of that. So that's what the conference was about. What was Jesus made out of, basically?
Let me just clarify one thing to avoid people from nitpicking. When you say the whole universal church, you mean what churches taught and believed. There were other skirmishes about Jesus and his divine nature up to this point.
Yes.
Yeah.
When I say, so we use the term universal church, historically you would call that the Catholic Church with a little c, the Apostolic Catholic Church. There was only one. There were a couple of fringe groups here and there, the Montanists and the Novatians, and they were kicked out of these Catholic churches. And when we say Catholic, we just mean all the churches all believed almost exactly what the apostles had handed over to them, and they took great pride in the fact that they were all unified in that. And now you've got this guy saying, well, what the apostles meant was that Jesus had a beginning. And it became quite a popular teaching because it wasn't as heretical as it sounds to us today because we have the Nicene Creed.
Right. We can look back on this. They're going through it.
They were hearing about this for the first time, and a lot of people were like, I guess I don't have a problem believing that Jesus had a beginning in eternity past because he's still around before anything else is made. Everything else is made through him and for him and by him and unto him. And so we can still worship him. He is still God, but he did have a beginning, and we're okay with that. And so there was a great confusion about that and infighting. And that's why Constantine said, we need to just decide, did Jesus have a beginning or not?
Yeah, and that's helpful background to have, because for us, thinking about it now, it might be easy to say, of course, Jesus is God, because that's what the Bible says, which is true. It should be that simple. But if you asked Arius or somebody that thought this way, do you have a high view of Jesus? They would say, absolutely.
Yes.
It's just struggling to see, how is he the Son of God and God? How is he distinct from the Father? All of those things are coming into play. And I run into this all the time today. People who say, well, he can't be God because he's God's son.
Right.
They're now wrestling through this. So the council comes together, and there's a lot that we can talk about as far as what actually happened at the council. So do you want to keep talking about Arianism? Do you want to touch briefly on the Paschal controversy? Where do you want to go from here?
Well, let's maybe just clarify that during those days, we can understand that there is a difficulty understanding the Trinity, especially when you don't have any books written about it. You don't have the creeds hammered out over hundreds of years. And so you had modalists who would believe that, God is one version of God at a time. So sometimes he's the Father, and then he changes into the Son, and then he changes into the Spirit. Then you've got Sabellianism, which is like, well, there's one God, but he plays these three different roles. He plays the role of a father, or he plays the role of an obedient son on the cross. And those were condemned as heresies. And then Arianism comes along and says, no, you get to keep everything you believe about Jesus exactly the same, but this will make a little bit more sense that, there was God the Father, and then he made a son. And there was a beginning to him. And yeah, he made him equal and all that, but it just clicked with people. That's why so many people were like, yeah, I like Arianism. So when they called a conference, though, all of the bishops then were debating this issue, and it was quite universally decided that Arian was wrong, and his buddy Eusebius of Mycodemia, not Eusebius of Caesarea, who we like, he was a historian and wrote about that, but his other friend, and they were told, no, you're wrong and you have to recant. And they didn't recant, and which is why they were excommunicated. So do you want to tell a little bit about the Father Christmas story, St. Nicholas?
Yeah, so one of my favorite fun facts about the Council of Nicaea is that Santa Claus was there.
Yeah, that's where we get Santa Claus from.
Yeah, so St. Nicholas of Myra, who's a very fascinating figure. If I remember correctly, he was a bishop. And I don't know if this story is actually true. It honestly probably isn't, but it's still, go ahead.
Well, you have to remember, a lot of our mythology about Santa Claus comes from the fact that these guys would have been very possibly wearing red robes with white woolen, the Santa Claus outfit, not the pants version. And maybe they came there in reindeer, and he had a reputation of being generous. So this really is the genesis of the Santa Claus story, but this is what he was actually like.
Yeah, so there's this account, and again, this is probably apocryphal, but it's a great story.
No, I love it. It's got to be true.
That St. Nicholas of Myra was so offended by Arius's teaching and his heresy about the person of Christ. There's this record of him walking up and hitting Arius, like literally smacking Arius in the face. So in our home, we don't talk as much about Santa Claus with reindeer, but we like to emphasize Santa Claus punched heretics.
That's right.
That's what he did.
And Constantine just sort of rapped him on the knuckles, kind of kicked him out of the room, but he didn't. He didn't actually get punished for doing that. So
if that actually happened, I don't know. But Saint Nicholas of Myra was present. Santa Claus was at the Council of Nicaea,
and Athanasius, who would later on become a great defender of the Trinity. At this point, he was not a bishop yet, though. He was a deacon, I believe. So he was there compiling the list of who was there and that kind of stuff. But he's an important figure later on. Yeah,
well, you also have a lot of these pastors, they're coming out of immense persecution. So these are not just random men. These are battle-hardened, scarred, persecuted people who have suffered for the sake of the gospel. There's some great anecdotes and stories that we have of Constantine greeting them, honoring some of these pastors who, I read one, again, maybe it came later and it's apocryphal, but this account of this pastor coming in with a limp from the immense persecution he had, and Constantine kisses him on the cheek and welcomes him. Like, it's a fascinating group of men that gather.
Yeah. And one of the issues that they did discuss, because it wasn't only the two controversies, and we can talk in our next episode about some of the other canons that came, these 20 canons, these 20 issues that they spoke about. One of them was what happens to somebody who was persecuted and lapsed during the persecution and denied Christ. And then after the persecution's gone, they now come and repent. What do we do with them? And some people said, well, no, that how convenient that you now repent. And others said, oh, well, you have to forgive them because they're repentant. And other people said, well, let the confessors decide. And a confessor was somebody who had not given in and had been tortured. Yeah.
Right.
But maybe let's talk about Easter.
Okay. So Easter, what we think of today, goes back to the Council of Nicaea. You want to talk about why?
Yeah, well, it goes back to the resurrection of Christ. But
the exact way that we choose to celebrate it.
So that's what the issue was. So you had this, the bishop of Rome, so the senior pastor of the main church in Rome, had received tradition that had been passed down by the couple of generations before him from Peter and from Paul, that you celebrate Easter on the Sunday closest to Passover. Straight after Passover, because you want to do it on a Sunday, because that's Resurrection Day. We even call it Resurrection Sunday. And yet there were churches in the East that had received apparently tradition from the Apostle John that you recognize and celebrate that day on the day of Passover. And so the Jewish calendar works out Passover, it's the 14th day of Nisan. And so it's based on the full moon. So I think it's the first... I'm not Jewish. It's the first something after the first full moon, and it's usually after the equinox. So equinox is March 21st, and after that, the first full moon afterwards, when it's the 14th of Nisan. So their months actually move a little bit throughout the year, whereas the Roman calendar was set and was different, and so. What they did is they figured out when that Resurrection Sunday would be, and you would fast on Good Friday. You don't fast on Easter; that's a day of celebration. But the people from the East, well, they were fasting on Passover, whenever that was, and so there was a clash about. What happened is that the Bishop of Rome got so upset about it that he he wrote a letter saying, "I want everybody to do it on the same day I do it," and the other bishops were like, "Yeah, no, we're not going to do that." So he excommunicated them. He kicked them out of the church. And they were like, well, then we're excommunicating you, and this is what caused this division that Constantine said, no, let's just pick a day, And so that's after much discussion, they landed on how we do it today. It's the Sunday closest to after Passover, after the equinox. Resurrection Sunday.
So that's the Paschal controversy, how we got the date that we celebrate Easter throughout the year. And then in addition to that, they're addressing the deity of Christ. Is the Son of God equal to God the Father, or the person of Christ? You want to get into that next?
Yeah, I think when we talk about the Nicene Creed, we can dig a little deeper into the substance. But as far as understanding it as a layperson and not as a history buff, I think it's helpful to say they weren't deciding if Jesus was God. They weren't deciding if he was equal to God or any of that stuff. That was already decided. That was already known and taught from the apostles all the way through. And at that point, the bishops weren't doubting that. Arius wasn't doubting that. He was specifically just adding this notion that there was a time in eternity past where Jesus' existence began, and before that there was no. He was created, and so he was a creature, even though it was before everything else. So that's really what it was about. And the reason that's important is because of Dan Brown and his annoying little book, The Da Vinci Code, which was made into a movie with Tom Hanks. And in that book, they claim, the characters claim that the Council of Nicaea invented the idea of deity and that of Christ, and that all of his disciples always just knew that he was a mortal man, he was just a prophet of God, until the Council of Nicaea, where they just made that up, that he was divine. And that's absolutely not true historically. And then they also say in that book that that's where the Bible was decided. They picked the 66 books of the Bible, which is also not true. In fact, the canon of Scripture wasn't even discussed at the Council of Nicaea. It was already recognized. Everybody already knew which books belonged in the Bible at that point.
Right. So now we're getting into some of the misconceptions about the council. One misconception is that the council somehow decided the books that are in the Bible completely inaccurate. You already mentioned another one, that this is when Christians started believing in the deity of Christ. The council did not invent a doctrine. It clarified a doctrine in the language that we use to describe the person of Christ.
Right. I mean, what they were really doing is saying you may not believe something else other than what we already all believe. And then they added the anathemas that if you say this, that there was a time where Jesus was not, then you're to be excommunicated.
Yeah. I actually have a quote from the Da Vinci Code in my notes here. So this is, of course, fiction, but a lot of people thought this was accurate because people read fiction, not history, so much. So he has in the book, quote, "Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicaea. It was a relatively close vote at that." Every word of that is wrong.
Yeah.
Literally every word of that is wrong.
Not even close to being true. And I mean, in Dan Brown's defense, he's a fiction writer. He's writing a story and he's making stuff up, and that's what they do. But he was sloppy in the way that he did it because it made it sound like it was based on history, and it was not.
Right. And you also have over 300 bishops present. And if I remember correctly, all but 2 of them affirm the Nicene Creed. So this was not something that was like a knife's edge. Which way are we going to go? Yeah.
And the 2 that weren't were Arius, who was being condemned by the whole council, and Eusebius of Academia.
And then another misconception or question that comes up is, was the Council of Nicaea a Roman Catholic council or operation as we think of it today? Was it Roman Catholic?
Yeah, and the answer is no. There was no such thing as Roman Catholic at that point. At that point, Catholic just meant everybody who believed what the apostles taught, all the churches. And there was no supreme pontiff. There was no pope. The Bishop of Rome was known as an important figure among the bishops. He was referred to as a first among equals, although he didn't have authority over the other bishops at all. And in fact, he didn't even come to the conference, and most people think that's just because of his age. He was too old to travel, and he sent 2 representatives to represent him there. And he was not considered the Pope by any means. And then after that, after the Council of Nicaea, I think sort of you're getting into the 400s and the 500s, then you start having this elevation of the Bishop of Rome as being a supreme pontiff over the other bishops and demanding their submission to him. And some did and some didn't. And eventually you get to 1054 AD, where the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of, I guess it's Antioch, one of the bishops in the East, they anathematize each other. And then that's what we call the Great Schism. And from then you've got the Eastern Orthodox churches and you have the Roman Catholic churches. And that's the genesis of the Roman Catholic Church, which is, 700 years later.
Right. But interestingly, as far as the Council of Nicaea, the Bishop of Rome was not actually present.
Right.
He had representatives, but he wasn't actually there.
Yeah. So there's no way this was a papal council like we think of them today.
So you mentioned that you have the Nicene Creed is produced, and we'll talk about that on the next episode. But you have 2 people that don't affirm it. Arius, you want to talk about what happens to Arius after the Council of Nicaea?
You want to tell that story? It's pretty cool.
Yeah, so he becomes the first state-exiled heretic, for one thing, and then he later comes back.
He recants.
Yeah. Does he officially recant?
Well, he sends a letter of recantation, which was accepted, and it turns out that he didn't really believe it. He sort of redefined terms, I think, so he didn't actually recant, but he was allowed back. And
he was brought back into the empire.
Yeah, and I think the pastor at Alexandria, or maybe it was the pastor's name was Alexander, I think.
Yeah, I think it's both. Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria.
Yeah. He was told to accept him into communion, and he didn't believe the recantation, rightly so, and so he didn't want to do it.
Right. So Alexander is struggling with this requirement he has to give Arius communion. And we have this record of him praying, and part of his prayer is he's praying to God, racked with guilt, pleading with God, quote, "But if I myself hold the true faith, may Arius suffer the penalty of his ungodliness deserves as the author of these evils." So he's basically praying, God, if I'm wrong, show me. But if Arius is wrong, please give him the penalty he's due. So we're leading up to Arius getting ready to take communion, and suddenly he has this violent, horrific seizure. where I don't want to get too graphic here, but
can I
essentially,
do it?
do you want
it?
to talk about bowels and what happened here?
Yeah, because there's actually a record of what happened. It said that he suddenly needed to relieve himself, the call of nature, and as he did, his bowels and then his intestines and a piece of his spleen and a piece of his liver all came out of him, and he had a massive hemorrhage and bled to death in front of everyone, an agonizing death.
So God answered Alexander's prayer.
Maybe.
Yeah. The judgment of God possibly came on Arius. Either way, the fascinating thing about the story is he was never served communion again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because he died.
Yeah. Either way, the Lord took him before that happened. And if you think like, no, that doesn't happen, just read 2 Chronicles 21, verses 18 and 19.
Joash, right?
Just to have another example. Jehoram. Yeah, and something very similar happens to him.
Yeah, so, he just bleeds out as well.
Yeah.
And you've got Ananias and Sapphira lying to the Spirit in the New Testament. You've got 1 Corinthians 11, Paul saying some of you are sick and dying in the Corinthian church because you're taking communion in an unworthy manner. And so, yeah, I think it's legitimate. Although Athanasius apparently wrote to say we should not assume this was God's judgment. Just because a man dies, you can't hold it against him.
It's still a pretty wild story. All right. Anything else on the history of the Nicene Creed? You want to recommend some resources?
Yeah. The last thing I want to do is just mention this book. I'll hold it up for the people in the video. It's called Decoding Nicaea. Decoding Nicaea by Paul Pavao. Constantine changed Christianity and Christianity changed the world. And this is just a nice summary of the history of it, as well as the 12 canons that came out of it, which we'll talk about in our next episode.
20, I think.
20
canons. 20 canons. And then one other resource I wanted to recommend as well. This is the first volume in Nick Needham's series, 2,000 Years of Christ's Power. This is 5 volumes. The first one is on the early church fathers, and this deals with Constantine and the Council of Nicaea, and it's an excellent resource, just in general, but especially on this period of history.
Yeah.
So, okay, that does it for this episode of Cage Free Theology.
See you next time.